The tide was low that morning. From the kitchen window, I watched the waves stretch toward the horizon, calm and steady, like they had something to say, but didn't need to rush it. My name is Eunice Merriman. I'm 75, a widow, and I've lived in this cedar-shingled cottage in Newport, Oregon for nearly 4 decades. The house sits just close enough to the shore to smell salt in the wood and hear the gulls complain over fish guts from the pier. I used to think that if my life ended quietly in this home, I would be at peace. That was before the call. It came just after I rinsed my teacup. I recognized the number. My only son, Jeremy. I smiled before I picked up. His voice came through cheerful. Too cheerful. "Mum, you don't have to pack anything. We're heading to the beach tomorrow. It's all taken care of. The house and your accounts are in my name now. You don't have to worry about managing things anymore." He spoke so easily, as if telling someone their life was no longer theirs was a kindness. There was no explanation, no gentle easing into it. Just a matter-of-fact statement, like a delivery notice. "A box has arrived. Your home has been removed." My breath caught in my throat, but I said nothing. I didn't ask him to repeat it. I didn't ask why. The sound of the ocean filled the silence like it had been waiting its turn to speak. My hands were still damp from the tea mug. I dried them on the edge of my sweater. I said, "All right, Jeremy." That was all. Then I hung up. Afterward, I sat in my chair by the front window and let the moment settle. I wasn't confused. I wasn't angry. I was hollow in the way an old well runs dry. No splash, just a silence so deep it echoes. If you've ever trusted someone with everything you are, only to realize they were quietly folding you out of the picture, then you know. It's not loud, not dramatic. It's a slow unraveling that only you can hear. The house around me didn't change, but it no longer felt like mine. I looked around at the books my husband and I had collected, the dried lavender in the clay bowl we bought in Montana, the cracked floorboard near the pantry that Jeremy used to trip over when he was 10. All of it suddenly felt like it belonged to a stranger. I didn't cry. Not then. There would be time for that. What I felt in that moment was something simpler, like the tide pulling back, a quiet knowing that something had shifted for good. If this has ever happened to you, you understand. If it hasn't, may it never come to your door. That afternoon, a white SUV pulled into the gravel driveway. I didn't recognize it. A young man stepped out, maybe in his 30s, wearing khakis and a company polo shirt. He glanced around like he wasn't sure if anyone was home, then walked up with a clipboard tucked under his arm. He said he was with Coastal Relocation Services, that he was there to assist with the transition of residents per the instruction of Laurie Grant. He didn't mention Jeremy. He didn't ask for permission to come in. He just smiled and said he'd start with the attic if I had the key. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't offer coffee. I handed him the key and walked back to the kitchen. The stove light flickered a little. I sat at the table and waited to hear the familiar sound of boxes unfolding. He worked quietly, efficient, polite in a professional sort of way. He moved through the house like it was a checklist. Attic, closet, hallway, master bedroom. He paused only once in the living room by the bookshelf. There was a photograph of Jeremy when he was 9, holding a trout almost half his size. He had a smile stretched across his face, wild and proud water dripping from his sleeves. I remember that day well. He had fallen into the river not 10 minutes before the picture was taken. Came up gasping, laughing. My husband Robert snapped the photo right as Jeremy lifted the fish. He called it the perfect day. Now that photo was gently wrapped in bubble wrap and placed in a labeled bin. By dusk, most of the upstairs was packed. The man gave me a carbon copy of an itemized inventory. There was a second page unsigned, titled Future Distribution Plan. At the top it read, "Owner of record, Jeremy Merriman." Not a word about me. Not even listed as a tenant. I looked at the name Laurie Grant. I had only met her once briefly 3 years ago. She had come to Thanksgiving wearing high heels and a ring the size of a marble. She spoke about wealth management, about restructuring for longevity, about how older generations should consider reallocating assets for those still building. She used terms like passive capital and generational rollover like it was natural to speak that way in a home full of hand-knit quilts and turkey stuffing. I remember her shaking my hand with both of hers and saying how she hoped I wouldn't feel too overwhelmed when the time came for change. I thought she meant aging. I didn't realize she meant replacement. That evening, I received an email from the credit union. My online access had been suspended. No explanation, just a notice of change in account administration. I tried calling the branch, voicemail. It occurred to me then with strange clarity that I wasn't part of the plan, not just in name or title, in presence. Jeremy hadn't failed to consult me. He had removed the need to, quietly, methodically, with every legal step papered and filed. It wasn't a mistake. It was a decision, and I was no longer in it. Audrey met me at the bus station with her arms already open. She was smaller than I remembered, but her hug hadn't changed. She had once been my student decades ago in a seminar on feminist literature and archival ethics. Now she was 70, retired from a long career in elementary education, and living alone in a little home tucked behind a park in Waldport. She led me upstairs to a suite above her garage. Sloped ceiling, soft light, a kettle already warming on the stove. There was a quilt folded neatly on the edge of the bed and a small bowl of wrapped caramels by the windowsill. The place smelled like cloves and eucalyptus. It didn't feel like a favor. It felt like a rival. Audrey said she had plenty of room and even more tea. She didn't ask for details. She just looked at my face, then brought out a box of oatmeal cookies and let me sit in silence. The next morning I unpacked what little I had. One of the leather pouches I brought contained a binder of old estate documents Robert and I had drawn up years ago. Living Trust forms contact info for our former attorney and a timeline of asset disbursements. It had sat untouched since 2016, but something told me I needed to go through it again. I laid the papers out across the bed, sorted them by type. There were folders labeled Funding Sources Beneficiaries Transfer of Deed. Then I found a yellow sticky note with my handwriting. It said, Living Heir Designation, Jeremy. I remembered that part. Back when Robert got the cancer diagnosis, we had discussed simplifying the trust in case one of us passed unexpectedly. We had written Jeremy in as the sole living heir to streamline probate. It had made sense at the time. He was an only child. He had a degree in finance. He knew how to handle things. But there was another sheet tucked behind the beneficiary page, an unsigned revision proposal. It suggested adding a clause that would trigger a legal review if the grantor was found to be under duress or medically impaired during any major transfer of control. Robert had called it a safeguard against future manipulation. I remembered how he leaned back in his chair and said that peace of mind mattered more than any signature. I flipped to the last section, a document labeled Amendment Review Worksheet. It had Jeremy's name in 2 places, once as the successor trustee and again as a power of attorney signatory. That was dated just after my hospital stay last year. That timing stung. I had been too groggy to drive myself to urgent care. I had called Jeremy asking for help with logistics. He arrived with papers to simplify things. I had signed them with shaking hands, grateful someone was handling the chaos. I had no memory of reading line by line. Audrey came in with a tray of lemon tea and paused when she saw the documents. She looked down, then looked at me. I told her everything. She sat quietly, then said she understood more than I thought. Her daughter had once tried to force a title change on the house, using similar language about preparing for the future. Audrey had fought back, but not everyone could. We stared at the papers for a long time. I didn't cry, I didn't rage, but I felt something shifting. Not fear, not sorrow. It was the first flicker of reckoning. 2 days after spreading the trust documents across Audrey's guest bed, I found a sealed envelope taped behind the last divider in Robert's old binder. It was thin yellowing with his handwriting in blue ink. No date, no address, just my name in his careful script. Inside was a single page titled Amendment Draft, Pause Clause Language. It outlined the very clause I had remembered if the trustee displayed signs of diminished capacity, or if there was suspected coercion by a beneficiary, the trust would be frozen for a formal review. It required the involvement of a third-party witness who could attest to a change in behavior or circumstance. It also recommended legal counsel be brought in, specifically someone experienced in elder trust litigation. Robert had never filed it, but he had written it, and now I had it in my hands. I showed it to Audrey over breakfast. She pushed aside her grapefruit and leaned in, reading each word like it was a map. When she looked up, there was steel in her voice I hadn't heard before. She told me she knew someone. A woman named Carol Fenn, a retired attorney who had once worked in elder protection law and now volunteered for a small legal collective serving seniors in Lincoln County. Carol took Audrey's call that same afternoon. They hadn't spoken in years, but Audrey's voice still carried weight. 2 days later, Carol showed up at the house. She wore a tan blazer, orthopedic shoes, and a dark green scarf tucked precisely at her collarbone. Her handshake was firm, her expression unreadable. We sat at the dining table while she laid out her yellow notepad and a pack of fine-point pens. I handed her the trust documents, the unsigned amendment, and a printout of Jeremy's power of attorney paperwork. She read everything without interrupting. When she finally spoke, it was with deliberate calm. She said the documents weren't illegal, but they were ethically problematic. The power of attorney had been signed during a time of temporary medical impairment, and no second opinion or witness had been recorded. That could be grounds for review, especially if paired with recent changes in my living situation. I mentioned the beach house transfer, the sudden account closures, Laurie's involvement. Carol's face didn't change, but she jotted something down. Then Audrey added her own story. Her daughter had once pressured her to sign over her home, using anxiety about future care as leverage. Audrey had held her ground, but the memory was still raw. That day, she offered to serve as my witness if needed. She had seen the shift in my behavior. She had been there when I left my own home. Carol nodded. She asked if I was willing to begin a pause clause activation. She said it would take time, letters would be filed, a hearing could be required. But the clause, once recognized, would freeze Jeremy's ability to make further transfers. The fund would go dormant until a full review could be conducted. I said yes. Then I asked the hardest question. What if it was too late? What if the damage had already been done? Carol looked me in the eye. She said trust law is not about undoing everything. It is about pausing the harm before it becomes irreversible. That night, I sat on the edge of the bed with the envelope Robert had written. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I placed it in a new folder, labeled it Evidence, and sealed it shut. Not for memory, for action. The hospital envelope arrived mid-morning, stamped in red with the word "Rissued." Audrey brought it up to the attic suite, along with a fresh pot of coffee. She didn't say a word, just placed it on the corner of my desk and walked away. I sat there a while before opening it. The paperwork inside was crisp, neatly stapled with a summary of my brief stay at Newport Regional 6 months ago. Dehydration, low blood pressure, confusion for a few hours. I remembered only fragments. The beeping of machines, Jeremy's voice, the scent of antiseptic and his cologne, something lemony. Then came the page that froze me, the signed authorization form for financial and medical power of attorney. It bore my signature. The timestamp was 3:47 p.m., the day I was admitted. According to the attending notes, I had been given medication less than an hour earlier. I remembered being dizzy. I remembered asking for water. I did not remember signing anything. But there it was. My name shaky, but unmistakably mine. Carol read the forms that evening. She didn't flinch. She just nodded. It was legal, she said. He hadn't forged anything. He had simply taken advantage of timing. Exploiting confusion was not the same as direct fraud, but it revealed intent. And intent was everything when you challenged trust administration. I felt a heat rise in my chest. Not anger, not betrayal, shame. He hadn't stolen from me. I had handed it all over. Carol didn't let me sit in that shame for long. She called it common. Said most elder exploitation started not with deceit, but with misplaced trust. Children who meant well until money entered the equation. Adult sons who saw aging parents as obstacles instead of elders. She had seen dozens of cases. Women who had built lives, careers, families. All undone with a pen and a few rushed initials. I didn't want to be one of them. I didn't want that to be the end of my name. We began building a timeline. I pulled out my old calendar. I still kept a paper one thick and bound in blue cloth. I flipped through pages and circled dates. The hospital visit. The account closures. The day Laurie showed up with the moving van. The week Jeremy blocked my calls. Each mark was a breadcrumb. Carol had me gather every statement I had access to. Audrey dug through my email backups, finding correspondence from our old bank. Together we found evidence that Jeremy had rerouted statements to a new address within 3 days of gaining power of attorney. It wasn't criminal, not yet. But it wasn't accidental either. That week I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I wrote a letter. Longhand. Not to Jeremy. Not to Laurie. To Robert. It wasn't a confession. It was a reckoning. I told him I had failed to protect what we built, that I had trusted too easily, that I had not seen the difference between love and control. Then I wrote another one, to myself, just 3 lines. You are not disposable. You are not confused. You are not finished. I folded the second letter into my wallet. Not for comfort, for reminder. Because there would be more papers ahead, more documents, hearings, explanations. And when the doubt came again, when my own memory wavered and my knees went soft, I would pull it out and read those lines again. I did not lose my life. I gave it away piece by piece. But that also meant I could start claiming it back. Page by page. The following Monday, I met Carol at a quiet tea room tucked behind the old city library. She preferred to avoid her office for conversations like these. Less clinical, she said. I appreciated that. We sat in a corner booth where the noise faded into the soft clink of porcelain. Carol took out a folder and laid it flat between us. On top was a single sheet labeled Merriman Living Trust Addendum B. It was the pause clause. Robert had added it during our last revision of the trust just 2 years before he passed. It stated that any major redistribution of assets could be temporarily frozen for up to 6 months if signs of undue influence, incapacity, or coercion were brought to light and confirmed by 2 credible sources. It was written in simple terms, designed not for courts, but for protection. A safety net for someone like me if the time ever came when I might lose clarity. We had never imagined it would be used against our own son. Carol explained the process. We needed an affidavit stating a change in my behavior that aligned with possible undue influence. A witness, a timeline. supplementary documents that could point toward manipulation or impaired judgment. Audrey volunteered without hesitation. She wrote a statement that detailed my behavior before and after the hospitalization. How I had gone from discussing book circles and donation plans to growing withdrawn, anxious, and confused. How Jeremy had started visiting less but calling more, and only when Laurie was in the picture. How I stopped making decisions on my own. Carol read it aloud once, then slid it into the folder. Her voice remained steady, but I caught a note of tension when she said Laurie's name. Later, Audrey told me why. Carol had once run a legal aid program for elderly residents at a long-term care facility. She had handled dozens of cases involving adult children who siphoned off assets through manipulation guilt or smooth-talking partners. One of those partners years ago had been Laurie's older sister. It didn't surprise me. There was a pattern to people like that. Confident, ambitious, always circling the aging like buzzards over a warm engine. Laurie spoke in slogans and numbers. She pitched ideas like elevator speeches. Jeremy never stood a chance. We moved to strategy. Carol suggested filing the affidavit and trust freeze first, then requesting a supervised review by Galvin Law Chambers, the firm Robert and I had named as our neutral executor. This would prevent Jeremy from making further transactions or changes while the trust was under evaluation. She also recommended documenting all recent activity phone logs, email chains, paper trails from the IRA account, and house title. I pulled out the manila folder I had been assembling for days. She smiled as she added it to her own. That evening, Audrey helped me craft a second affidavit. One from me. It wasn't dramatic. Just a clear, factual account of the weeks surrounding my hospitalization, the documents I had signed, and the consequences that followed. I didn't write about betrayal. I didn't write about grief. I wrote about names on forms, closed bank branches, unreturned calls. I left space for the pain to settle later. We mailed the documents the next morning. As we walked back to Audrey's, the breeze from the bay cut across the sidewalk and lifted the ends of my scarf. For a second, I felt almost weightless. Audrey nudged my shoulder. "One step at a time," she said. And it was true. The damage hadn't happened overnight. Neither would the undoing. But that morning, with my name freshly written and my words sealed in an envelope, I felt something I hadn't in weeks. I felt the beginning of weight returning to my spine. And that was enough for now. Audrey's kitchen table became my command center. I cleared a space between her old sewing machine and the stack of puzzle boxes she never quite got to. Each morning, I made tea, turned on the desk lamp, and pulled out the manila folder where I had started to piece together a narrative. Not a dramatic story, just facts. Dates, numbers, names. It started with the email logs. I printed out every exchange between me and Jeremy from the past year. Messages about bank transfers, digital forms, routine updates that no longer felt so routine. Then came the phone records showing a sudden drop in my outgoing calls after the hospitalization. Fewer conversations with friends, fewer appointments scheduled. More messages from unknown numbers, most traced back to companies affiliated with Laurie. Next were the forms themselves. The ones I signed during that foggy week in the hospital. I lined them up in order: the general power of attorney, the living trust amendment, the updated deed. I didn't even recognize my own handwriting on some of them. I paused over the signature on the house transfer form. It was mine, but it looked rushed, uneven. There was a small ink smudge near the bottom corner, as if I had signed it while sitting up in bed. I took out a blank page, wrote my name slowly, then again, a little faster. I studied the curve of the letters. I was still here. I was still me. That thought anchored me. By the end of the week, I had filled a binder with labeled tabs: communications, legal documents, financial statements, witness affidavits. Audrey helped me organize everything chronologically. Carol sent over a checklist of supporting documents that would strengthen the review. Each night, I wrote in a separate notebook. Not legal notes, just observations. I jotted down what it felt like to lose your own reflection in the mirror, what it meant to go quiet, because no one seemed to hear you anymore. I didn't know if those pages would be useful later, but they helped me understand what I had given up and what I still had power to reclaim. In the afternoons, I sometimes walked to the edge of the bluff near Audrey's house. The ocean was louder there, the wind unfiltered. One afternoon, I watched a gull dive toward a rock and pull up at the last moment, banking hard into the wind. It made no sound, just moved, deliberate, sharp. That night, I added another section to the binder. It was labeled Rebuilding. I started listing the assets that remained untouched. A joint savings account Robert and I had set up in 1994, still in my name. A small parcel of land outside Florence that Jeremy didn't even know existed. A few rare books from Robert's collection stored in archival boxes in the attic. Pieces of my life that were still mine. I photocopied my old library badge and slipped it into the front pocket. It reminded me of who I was before the titles were stripped away. Elder, mother, widow, librarian. That one still held weight. By the following Monday, Carol had everything she needed to initiate the formal pause review. She filed the paperwork with Galvin Law Chambers. A week later, we received confirmation. The trust was frozen pending evaluation. No changes could be made without oversight. The house, the accounts, even the digital access, all locked. I stared at the final confirmation email and exhaled slowly. The fight wasn't over, but something had shifted. It wasn't just that I had taken steps toward justice. It was that for the first time in months, I had spoken in a language Jeremy couldn't twist. A language written in forms and timelines and legal citations. I didn't need to yell or beg. I only had to show the truth. Typed, filed, stamped. And soon it would speak louder than anything he had tried to bury. It was Audrey who first brought it up. She had come back from her morning walk, a folded flyer clutched in her hand. It was glossy, printed in pastel colours, with Laurie's photo at the top, smiling broadly framed by flowers and soft focus lighting. The heading read, Coastal Women's Renewal Fund, Supporting Dignity for Seniors. I stared at it confused. Audrey laid it flat on the table and tapped the logo in the bottom corner. It matched the one I'd seen weeks ago on an unfamiliar withdrawal from my community foundation account. That name had sounded like one of the groups I used to support, back when Robert and I set up the Legacy Endowment. But now I looked closer, and the details weren't right. I never approved funding to anything by that title, especially not one spearheaded by Laurie. The fine print at the bottom of the flyer was even more troubling. It claimed the fund was backed by the Merriman estate and actively supported by Eunice Merriman, retired community leader and educator. I didn't remember signing anything with that language. Audrey's eyes were already scanning the names listed as board advisors. Laurie's name was at the top. Jeremy's was third. She leaned over the table. We made copies. Carol came by later that afternoon and we went over everything together. She didn't say much, just quietly highlighted sections of the flyer and underlined the phrases with legal weight. She made a note of the tax identification number printed at the bottom. Then she picked up her phone and stepped out onto the porch. When she came back in, her face was tight. She explained that the organization had recently filed for state-level grants in both Oregon and California, listing my name and signature as their founder. That signature, she added, didn't match the one on any other official documents filed this year. There it was. I had assumed the worst had already happened. I thought being pushed out of my own home, stripped from my financial identity, and left adrift was enough. But this was different. This was Jeremy and Laurie stepping into the public using my name, not just to take from me, but to gain access to money meant for others. Community funds, grant money, public trust. They were using the respect I had built across decades to polish their scheme. Audrey sat beside me and didn't speak for a while. She just placed her hand over mine. Her grip wasn't tight, but it was steady. That mattered. Carol finally spoke. She said this shifted things from a civil dispute into the territory of state-level fraud. If proven, it could result in not only frozen assets, but criminal charges. I listened, but the words didn't quite land. Not yet. I kept seeing that flyer, kept seeing Laurie's bright, photo-ready smile, kept hearing Jeremy's voice from that first phone call, calm and decisive, assuring me this was all being done for my own good. I was tired, not just physically, but from the weight of having to prove myself real again. From knowing they'd used the parts of me I was most proud of: my public service, my steady reputation, my commitment to women's education, and bent them into something unrecognizable. Audrey made tea. Carol packed her documents. I walked out onto the porch and let the evening air settle on my skin. I thought about all the women I had taught over the years, the ones who learned to speak up through letters and petitions and quiet acts of resistance. I had always told them that dignity wasn't something people gave you. It was something you claimed. And now it was my turn. Carol filed the initial fraud alert that night. By morning, the fund's public site was flagged for investigation. An email came in from Galvin's office confirming that all financial activity involving my estate would be under temporary lockdown until further legal review. They had borrowed my name. Now they would see what it truly stood for. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday afternoon at the Galvin Law Office, a 2-story stone building just off the old highway. It had weathered shutters and a metal sign out front, nothing fancy. But inside, the air was sharp with cedar and fresh coffee, and everything smelled like preparation. Carol arrived first, calm and precise, her folder of evidence tucked under her arm. Audrey came along too at my request. She didn't say much, but her presence was grounding a quiet witness to everything that had led us here. Jeremy and Laurie were 10 minutes late. When they walked in, Laurie led the way, all confidence in her crisp blazer and patent heels. Jeremy trailed behind his tie, slightly crooked eyes, flicking between Carol and the reception desk. We were ushered into a conference room. A long oak table sat under soft track lighting. Galvin, the estate overseer, greeted us neutrally, offered water, and invited everyone to sit. No one made small talk. Carol opened the meeting by stating clearly and formally that we were here to request a freeze on all transactions involving the Merriman Living Trust. She slid a folder to Galvin containing the flyer, the altered documents, and a notarized affidavit outlining the fraud concerns. Laurie scoffed and leaned back in her chair. She made some offhand remark about misunderstandings and family stress. Jeremy stayed quiet. Galvin glanced through the documents with a furrowed brow. He asked Carol a few questions. She responded with dates, emails, bank references, notarized statements. Her tone was calm but firm. Galvin nodded, made notes, then turned to Laurie. She didn't wait for a question. She stood up, grabbed her purse, and announced that if this was going to be a witch hunt, she had better things to do. Without looking at Jeremy, she walked out. The door clicked behind her. Jeremy blinked, then stared down at his hands. The room went still. Galvin cleared his throat and asked him directly if he had authorized any financial activity under my name or in connection with the Coastal Women's Renewal Fund. Jeremy mumbled something about helping expand access, about good intentions, about how I had always supported community projects. Carol didn't interrupt. She simply placed a second folder in front of him. Inside were screenshots of emails signed with my forged signature check deposits under his name and grant requests citing my past work. Jeremy didn't argue. I watched him shrink into his chair. For the first time in months, he looked like the boy I once raised. Not the man who had called me and calmly stripped away my life, but the teenager who once stood on our deck and asked if the ocean would ever swallow the house. He said he didn't know it had gone that far, that he hadn't read everything Laurie filed, that he thought it was temporary just to stabilize things. Galvin glanced at me. I nodded once. Carol then requested on my behalf an immediate freeze on all trust-related activity. Galvin agreed. He would submit the pause clause activation paperwork by end of day and inform all affiliated institutions of the status change. It was done. The legal process would stretch for months, maybe longer. But the damage had been halted. For now, no one could move, alter, or access anything related to my name, my estate, or my late husband's legacy. Jeremy stood, but I didn't. He started to say something. Maybe sorry, maybe explanation. I didn't ask. Outside, the sun had started dipping behind the hills, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Audrey helped me into her car. Carol followed in hers. In the rear-view mirror, I saw Jeremy standing alone on the law office steps, hands shoved in his pockets, looking smaller than I remembered. Not every confrontation ends with yelling. Some end with silence and a locked door behind you. Carol's paperwork moved fast. Within 48 hours, the freeze was confirmed across all major accounts and assets tied to the Merriman Living Trust. Letters went out. Logins locked. Any attempt to transfer, withdraw, or modify details would trigger a legal notification and inquiry. I stayed at Audrey's for the week, letting things cool down. She gave me space, only checking in during coffee refills, or when the late-night news turned too grim to bear alone. On Thursday, a letter arrived from Galvin's office. It was a formal invitation for both parties to provide supplemental statements regarding the trust and the misuse concerns. There was nothing dramatic in the wording, but underneath it was a quiet demand for reckoning. Jeremy called that night. I didn't pick up. 2 days later, he knocked on Audrey's door. He looked tired. Not in the way people look after a long trip or a restless night, but the kind of tired that starts behind the eyes and sinks into the bones. Audrey stepped aside without a word and left us alone in the kitchen. He sat across from me, hands wrapped around a mug of untouched tea. No Laurie, no excuses. Just silence thick as soup. Finally, he spoke. He started by saying he had never meant for it to become this, that Laurie had ideas and spreadsheets and ambitions, and he went along because it seemed organized. Efficient. That word lingered in the air like smoke. I didn't respond. He kept talking about how scared he was when I got sick that day, how he panicked, how the power of attorney papers felt like a safety net. Then how that safety net slowly turned into something else, something that gave him control, and how control once tasted becomes its own kind of drug. He said he didn't even notice when the lines blurred, when he began speaking on my behalf without telling me, when my voice became optional in conversations involving my own estate. He didn't plan to hurt me, but at some point, not hurting me was no longer part of his plan at all. I still said nothing. He looked at me then, really looked, and asked what I wanted. I looked out the window. The hydrangeas had started to bloom in Audrey's yard, soft purple clouds against the rusted fence line. I turned back to him. I told him I didn't want anything. That was the point. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want apologies carved out of guilt. I didn't want a clean-up crew for what had already been so carelessly torn apart. What I wanted was never asked in the first place. He looked away. And in that pause, I saw the real fracture, not between mother and son, but between what we once were and what we had allowed ourselves to become. Carol had told me not to make any binding agreements in private. So I didn't. I simply told him the truth, that the documents had been frozen, that the investigation would run its course, that his name could be removed if he stepped down willingly, and that he needed to make peace with the idea of earning trust the slow way. He nodded, not like a man agreeing, but like one admitting he had no fight left in him. He stood paused by the doorway and asked if I was going to come back home. I didn't answer, because in that moment the house wasn't what mattered. It was the name on the deed, and whether I still believed I had the right to claim it. He left. No promises, no handshakes, just a quiet retreat. Sometimes grief doesn't howl, it sighs, and in that sigh something ends, and something else quietly begins. The hearing was quiet. No witnesses took the stand, no gavel slammed, no shouting matches between lawyers. It wasn't that kind of trial. The judge reviewed the paperwork Carol submitted, spoke to each party individually behind closed doors, and called it a sensitive matter involving potential exploitation within family structures. That was the official phrasing. The outcome came 2 weeks later in a plain envelope. The court accepted the pause clause. The trust would remain frozen for 6 months. All activity halted. No sales, no transfers, no new authorizations. Nothing would move without the court's written approval. Carol called me directly that afternoon. She read the order aloud, her voice steady, her tone calm. Then she paused like she was weighing how to say the next part. The court had granted me full discretionary power to revise beneficiary designations during the freeze. I could change names, add protections, or even dissolve the trust entirely. If I submitted a verified psychological evaluation, confirming full mental clarity. She didn't have to ask what I planned to do. She already knew. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt quiet, like standing on a dock after the boat has pulled away, waves still rocking from its departure. There was no celebration, just stillness, and the echo of something that used to matter. I mailed the amendment the next morning, removed Jeremy's name from the accounts, froze Laurie's access to anything connected to my name, including that so-called community fund. Carol flagged the non-profit as a potential fraud case. Whether Laurie ran or fought back was no longer my concern. That same evening, Jeremy left a voicemail. He said he understood, that he wouldn't contest it, that he wanted to step away before he caused more damage. His voice cracked near the end. It wasn't an apology, just the sound of a man realizing the distance he had created could no longer be crossed the same way again. The house on Harbour View was still mine, technically, but I hadn't gone back. Instead, I returned to the guest room at Audrey's, still smelling faintly of lavender and old books. She didn't ask questions, just brewed tea and opened the window wide. We sat in silence, the kind shared by women who had learned how to rebuild themselves in pieces. She placed a hand on mine when the sun began to set. "You did what most wouldn't," she said. "You didn't fight fire with fire. You stood still and let the truth speak." I squeezed her hand gently, not out of gratitude, but out of recognition. There's no winner in a war like this. Only survivors. And I had survived. I wasn't planning to press charges. That wasn't weakness. That was choice. To not let bitterness outlive the betrayal. I didn't need Jeremy in jail to feel free. I just needed my name untangled from the things that no longer belonged to me. He would carry what he had done, and I would carry what I had learned. As for Laurie, she vanished. Carol said her name no longer appeared in the filings, no updates, no new grants, no new schemes, just absence. Sometimes the loudest exit is silence. In the days that followed, I began writing again. Not books, not letters, just pages filled with memory, with detail, with my voice, reclaiming what had nearly been signed away. The tide rolled in one morning stronger than usual, and I thought to myself, maybe the sea knew. that sometimes it takes more strength to remain than to leave. And I was still here. The house by the sea hadn't changed much. The wind still slipped through the window panes in the early morning. The boards on the back deck still creaked when I stepped outside with my coffee. And the tide still rose and fell like it had every day since Harold and I first bought this place half a century ago. But I had changed. Returning wasn't triumphant. It was quiet. I unpacked slowly. 1 box a day. I found our old wedding photo tucked behind yellowing papers. I placed it near the window where the sun touched it first every morning. It wasn't about remembering him. It was about remembering me beside him. Audrey came by with a blueberry pie. We sat in the kitchen, our forks resting on china plates older than either of us liked to admit. She asked if it felt strange being back. I told her no. It felt like standing on firm ground again after months of drifting. I had removed Jeremy's name from the trust, closed all access points, and restructured my estate under my own terms. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. There were things a mother could forgive, and there were things she couldn't afford to ignore. That was one of the hardest truths I had come to learn. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being angry. I just felt clear, like walking into a room with all the windows open. One afternoon, I sat by the window with my notebook. I wrote 5 words in black ink, slow and steady, like carving them into stone. I am still right here, not out of defiance, not out of pride, but because it was true. Even when people try to write you out, sometimes you write yourself back in. If you've ever felt like someone tried to erase you from your own story, maybe this one spoke to you. There are moments we give too much out of love and forget our names in the process. But Eunice found her way back, not by screaming, but by standing firm. If you've lived through something like this, I invite you to share your voice below. Your story might be the light someone else needs to find their way home. This channel is for women like us, strong, quiet, and still here.